Welcome, City Council. I suspect that we will have Kendall in here shortly. We appreciate all those who are here to observe the council tonight, and we thank you for your attendance. This is the Bountiful City Council meeting Tuesday, February 7th, 2018. We did have a work session at 6 p.m. that's in the planning room off to the north right here, and the public is always welcome and invited to our work session as well as this regular part of our City Council meeting. We will start tonight by having a Pledge of Allegiance, and we've asked Thomas Thorne if he would come and lead us in a pledge. Thomas, what troop are you from?
732.
What part of Bountiful is that?
Up by Miller Park Junior High.
Great. Thank you, Thomas.
May the audience please arise. Repeat after me the Pledge of Allegiance.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
2. The audience may be seated.
Well done, Thomas. Well, it's our privilege tonight to have Reverend Lynn Briggs, and Reverend Briggs is with the Episcopal Church of the Resurrection, and she is offering our prayer for tonight. Thank you so much, Lynn, again for coming.
Thank you, Mayor and council members. It's my pleasure to be here. It's been my privilege to serve as the vicar of the Church of the Resurrection for 8 years. During that time, our small congregation has intentionally tried to become more and more focused on community. We organize tutors at Washington Elementary School in Bountiful. We support their teachers with supplies and gift cards, and we had the joy of putting on a Christmas party for the teachers at our church. That was fun. We offer community garden plots behind our building to the neighbors around us. And we partner with the Bountiful Food Pantry in providing once a month a meal at no charge at our church to whoever walks in our doors. And we have 150 people each time we do that. That is widened to a partnership with several LDS wards who send over food as well as volunteers to help serve. It's been a remarkable experience for all of us. These community dinners gather people from all walks of life. Some of them you can tell are hungry and want to stretch their budget and get a really good home-cooked meal. Some are busy parents wanting a night off from cooking. Others are simply lonely people looking for others to share an evening with so they don't have to eat alone. But all of us who serve and all of us who come are blessed. Everyone benefits from this community of caring on those evenings. And we don't know everyone's names, but we've become very familiar with the faces and their smiles over the last 7 years. I wanted to tell you this because I know as people in service to the public, you understand the value of community and kindness and sharing resources that benefit all of us. It is so very clear to me that we need each other because God made us to be in community. And I thank you for serving this community. I thank God for you. And I thank God for the wide circle of people who care for each other and each other's welfare. And now I'd like to ask God to bless the work that you do and bless the efforts and the challenges that you face as you care for the community of Bountiful. Let us pray. O God, the creator of us all, we come before you with grateful hearts for the strength and caring which is at the heart of this community. We ask you now to bless the people of Bountiful and bless the efforts of those who serve on the City Council for the common good. Send down upon them the spirit of wisdom, charity, and justice, that they may make wise decisions. Grant them courage and grace in the exercise of their duties, and give them insight into the needs and concerns of the community they serve. In your holy name we pray. Amen.
Reverend Briggs, thank you so much for sharing
Thank you.
your congregation and what you do there with us. It means a lot to all of us here to be community, and that's what we want. We want to share together.
Well, if you're ever hungry on the third Wednesday of any month, there's always a free meal at our place.
I'd
So
love
you're
to
all
come.
welcome.
I'm hungry almost all the time, as you can see, Reverend Briggs. But I really appreciate the offer.
Thank you.
you. Very kind. This is the time for our public comment period, and anyone that is here is welcome to come and express themselves for a couple of minutes. We ask you to keep it to 2 minutes. This is at the most a 10-minute segment of our city council meeting. If you're here as part of the public hearing later in our agenda, then we'd ask you to wait till then if you're here specific for this ordinance and the downtown issues. Otherwise, I'm going to turn some time over to anyone who wishes to come up, and the time is yours. Thank you. We will proceed with our agenda, and we're glad that you're feeling good about things, those who are here. Like to have a motion to approve our minutes of the previous meeting, if there isn't a, thank you.
Mayor?
Mark. Yeah, excuse me.
Mayor, I'd like to make a correction in the minutes.
Please do. That was my next question.
On page 2, line 32 of our last minutes,
Tidwell.
it's Stratton Tidwell, O-N, Stratton Tidwell,
Another T-O-N, actually.
another T-O-N, Stratton Tidwell.
Okay.
Thank you, Mayor.
Thank you. Any other corrections or additions that we know of? If not, I'd look for a motion to approve.
Mayor, I'll move we approve the minutes.
Second.
Thank you. All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? That motion passes. Thank you. And council reports. So let's start with you, Richard.
Nothing this evening, except that we had a great tour at the History Museum. Of course, those of you who were there and knew that. But they're looking to hopefully open in full by handcart days. They've got some great displays going in, some capable people helping them out, and some pretty exciting things going on over there.
What did you think? A couple of highlights share with our folks here.
I was amazed by the Bountiful lumber saw that they have downstairs.
Oh, gosh.
Incredible.
It
And that
was a-
the train and diorama in the upstairs is honestly just unbelievable. So,
When it totally opens and people see it, it's not just the kids that are going to want to see that train.
no.
It's Old Bountiful, and it's amazing
It
what
is.
they did. Thank you, Richard, for sharing that. John Mark?
I have nothing.
And Beth?
Let's see, so there's just a couple pieces of legislation. Did you want to, I'll go ahead and go for it. So I wanted to thank everyone on behalf of their efforts to contact their legislators in regards to House Bill 175. Unfortunately, I have to report that it is had an additional substitution, and it is back circled again, but we anticipate that it might come up again. They've made some modifications, but there you go. And that, I'll just remind you guys, House Bill 175 was the Legislative Oversight Committee. That was a duplication of what is already in existence, so.
Good modifications or bad modifications?
We think the whole premise is poorly done, and so I can't really say good or bad. It's not any worse to the cities, if that's any help.
Yeah.
And then there's, let's see, there's other legislation that is pending this week several people might have read about House Bill 462, which is the homeless bill. That just went out of committee yesterday. There's a couple of other bills. Well, actually, there's a lot of other bills. There's about 277 bills that we're following right now that impact local issues. So those are just kind of the highlights, if you will, unless there's anything you wanted to add, Gary. I can't think of anything really. I mean, let's see. No, I think that's about it. Those were our major ones for yesterday.
Mr. Mayor, could I ask a question about homeless funding?
Well, please do.
So does the county not collect sales tax in cities as well?
Yes, they have they collect sales tax in unincorporated areas,
Right.
and and that's a different rate than they have for incorporated areas. So the answer is yes. It's a lesser rate than they do in the unincorporated area.
Okay.
But they typically don't have the population base, of course, that an actual city does.
Right.
But no, there's no good reason why the state isn't asking the counties to also contribute in addition to the cities.
Right.
Yeah, I didn't know how much I wanted to get into the weeds on that one, but that was one of the critical issues, I think, that, that we really have been taking a hard look at, because it has, the premise of some of that legislation is that the cities are responsible for the cost of housing, which I think is market-driven, which I know is market-driven, I should say, so.
Well,
Anything else? Oh, go ahead. Go ahead, Richard.
Sorry to, again, be
No,
off
you're
in the
fine.
weeds. Not to mention the fact that housing cost has very little to do with our homeless problem, frankly. So, just another comment.
And an excellent comment on that as
Yeah.
well. Thank you.
Anything else, Beth?
Nothing,
There's
nothing
a
more,
lot.
those are kind of the highlights, if you will.
For some of you who don't know, Beth Holbrook is the president of the Utah League of Cities and Towns. There's only one in the state of Utah that represents all 248, sometimes it's 247, I don't know what the current number is, but it's either 247 or 248, good for you scouts to remember this,
So
of cities and towns in the
decide.
state of Utah. And she represents that, so she's, this is about the only time probably during the week that she is not up on the hill doing something. So thank you, Beth, for that.
Thank you.
Chris?
Kind of dealing with the homeless, if I can make a comment.
Sure.
I had an encounter yesterday. My wife and I were at a local market in Bountiful. Standing at the door was a panhandler. This panhandler smelled rather ripe. He was right at the door. You had to walk around him, and he would come up and say, "Could you give me some money?" And you'd walk around him. My wife went in, I went and parked the car, came back, and he went back to the same position, and I saw a mom walking towards the door, and I could see on her face she was concerned. And so I walked over towards the fellow, and to make a long story short, I escorted the lady into the supermarket without saying a word to the fellow. He went back to the front of the door and proceeded to do the same thing again. And he did that 2 or 3 times, of which time I went back and escorted the lady into the supermarket. What I'm getting at is panhandling in our city, I think, is spilling over from what's in Salt Lake, and I'm concerned. And I'm hoping, and I talked with Chief Ross about it, and on private property, residents have, and store owners have the right to ask a panhandler to leave his property. When they're on public property, we can't unless they become aggressive. Now, I'm concerned, and to you young scouts, do a good turn daily. I think we need to watch and become aware of what we see going on. And if we need to step up, we need to step up and do something. But I'm concerned about panhandling and what's coming into our city, and I don't know how we address it, but I think it's something that should be on our radar. Thanks, Mayor.
Thank you, Chris. And Kendall, please.
I don't have anything to report tonight, thanks, Mayor.
Thank you. We'll consider the approval of weekly expenditures of greater than $1,000 paid February 5th and 12th of 2018. If you don't have any questions, I would look for a motion.
Happy to make the motion that we approve the expenditures from the 5th and the 12th as printed.
Second.
Thank you. Any further discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? That is also taken care of. And, number 6, Alan Farnes. Whoa, there you are, Alan. Good to see you.
Thank you, Mayor and members of the council.
It looks like you get to be up here for a while,
Yeah,
Alan.
A couple of items.
Do you need a
yes.
chair?
No, I'll be all right.
All right.
The first item is the extension of the contract with ECI. It's Electrical Consultants Incorporated that has been helping us with the major rebuild at our 138 substation. We hired them back in May, and they've done an excellent job in keeping this project on schedule. There's a lot of equipment we had to buy, had long lead times, and they've been really good to keep up with that. We have had some additional work as a result of having to coordinate with Rocky Mountain Power on this project, and it was a little difficult to anticipate exactly how much. So that has driven the cost up, as well as trying to keep things on schedule created quite a bit of overtime for them. So we are asking for an additional $75,000 extension to the contract. And that would put their engineering services at about 10.5% of the total project cost.
Any questions for Alan?
Is that 10.5% in line with typical engineering costs?
Yeah, that's,
Perfect.
yep,
That was my only question.
And we're in budget, Alan,
yes,
here with this.
yeah.
Any other questions?
Mr. Mayor, I'd like to make a motion that we approve the additional cost for ECI engineering services for the 138 substation in the amount of $75,000, not to exceed $560,000 as recommended by staff.
Second.
Thank you. Any further discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? That motion passes. Next item, Mr. Farnes.
Okay, the next item is directional boring. We went out and invited 6 different companies to bid on. We have quite a few areas in the city that we want to bore in some conduit, anywhere from 1 to 4 conduits in each bore. There's a total of 7,125 linear feet between all these projects. And the average linear cost per foot would be $34,048. And we received bids from 4 of the companies, and the low bid is Americom Technology for $245,689. And we've worked with them before and recommend accepting that bid.
Any questions from the council?
Paul, did you get that per linear foot price?
Well, I was going to check that. Let's got my calculator right now.
I wondered if you were going for a calculator. Alan, you may have added a couple of zeros to the linear foot price. I'm just saying.
Probably not 34,000, probably just 34.
Yeah, there
Sorry.
we go. There we
Sorry.
I'll
go.
just help you out there.
Good job.
3448, yes.
Okay,
I misspoke.
thank you. No,
worries.
that's why we're here, to ask questions. Any other inquiries to Mr. Farnes? If not, I would look for a motion.
Mr. Mayor, I'd like to make a motion that we approve the bid for American Technologies in the amount of $245,689 for underground directional boring as recommended by staff and the Power Commission.
And I'll
Second.
look for a second. Did you say a second, Richard?
Yes.
Thank you. Any further discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? You're on a roll.
Okay,
Mr. Barnes.
the third item is the purchase of some distribution transformers. We went out to bid on this item there's a total of 46 transformers, various sizes, and these will be, they're transformers we would just put into stock and then use them as needed. They're not for any specific projects. We received 3 bids. We are not recommending the low bid because we have had some problems with GE sticking to their delivery schedule. And so we are recommending taking the second bid for $83,814.
So when you say you've had problems with them sticking to their delivery schedule, you just don't trust that they'll deliver within 9 to 12 weeks, or?
The last order we purchased from GE, they didn't deliver any of the transformers on time, and some of them were out twice as long as they had told us. And then they didn't come in with the primary bushings, so we had to get them to send us the primary bushings and install those. So it's not, what is it, about $5,000, little over $5,000. It's worth going that extra, and it gives us an opportunity to send a message to GE that you can't treat your customers this way.
Is this in budget, Mr. Barnes?
Yes.
Again?
Looks
Thank
like
you.
it's about $100 extra per transformer is all, in order to get them on time.
Yeah.
So,
The Power Commission felt strongly about this as well.
yeah.
Thank you.
Cool.
Any further comments to Mr. Barnes? If not, I'd look for a motion.
Mr. Mayor, I'd like to make a motion that we approve the bid from Annexter Power Solutions for an ARMCO, ARMCO transformers in the amount of $83,814.68 as recommended by the Power Commission and by staff.
And a second?
Second.
Thank you. Any further discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed?
Thank
Mr.
you.
Barnes, thank you.
Alan, I just do have one question. Do you think that there's any chance that that they would have the same problem?
We've
GE
purchased from ARMCO before and have not had a problem with them.
Okay,
GE, the whole company is kind of,
there's been some
turmoil right
problems?
now, so,
Okay. Okay,
and it's not the first time either. We've
yeah.
had
It's
several
kind of
problems with
repeated.
them. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. Thanks for getting these bids.
You're welcome. Thank you.
We'll turn some time now over to our city attorney, Mr. Clint Drake.
I guess you could say that's no more Mr. Nice Guy. Thank you, Mayor. I would turn your attention to a lease agreement that has been provided to you in the packet for a cell tower that the council approved a few months ago for 474 East Hidden Lake Drive. Just to remind you, that's Singular Wireless, which is AT&T. There was a bit of a delay between the approval of the site plan and then the agreement. They had their own agreement that they had proposed, which was substantially larger than this one. This is the same agreement that we have used with all of our recent approvals, and I indicated to them that we are trying to streamline our processes, make it much more easy for the legal department as well as all of the departments to keep track of things. So after some time, they agreed to our form of the agreement. It's almost identical to the last 2 agreements that you've approved. Very, very minor changes that I can point out to you if you'd like to, but they're pretty technical, really. And with that, I would submit it to the council for any questions.
Clint, this isn't a question in regards to the contract itself. It's just a question in terms of the AT&T, and I'm assuming other carriers do this as well, but they have different names for some of the, different names, different states from where they're from, and this one under Singular Wireless. Is that typical, or are they Is that an unusual circumstance?
No, it's fairly typical. And sometimes you will see a cell tower company or a cell phone company like AT&T or any of the other providers that have different names. Singular used to be what they were called, and I think AT&T bought them, bought Singular out years ago, and so they've kept this portion of the company. That arm does the leasing. You'll also see third-party providers. Names like Crown Castle might come to mind. They basically manage sites and will buy sites themselves too, and then lease it themselves. Most cities, including Bountiful City, when approached by somebody like that, we've typically just turned them down. We like to own the land that it's on, and we have a little bit of control, and it's a nice revenue stream for the city as well. So yeah, it can be hard to keep track of at times. The other day I was looking at one, and it was a voice stream. You might remember that one. So they just change from time to time. You've got to keep your eye on it because it changes quite a bit.
Thank you.
Yep.
Clint, so could you help me with the small cell legislation that's going on and how does that integrate
No,
at all? How's this separate?
So this is what's referred to as a macro cell site. Totally different. I can explain the differences to you, or I can just give you the simple answer that this is very different. This doesn't apply to that.
Okay, that's all I need to know.
Okay.
Any other questions?
Yeah, why is it called Brasher's Auto Auction Cell Site?
That is what they call it, and I didn't ask that question. Chad, do you know?
Yeah, we know. They were doing two cell sites at the same. They were doing two cell sites at the same time with this project internally. One of them is down by Brasher's Auto Auction, and this one just got lumped in with the same name.
It's a constant thing. Most of the cell sites have a name that have nothing to do with them.
Yeah.
For example, the one that was approved for the Bountiful Rec Center was Starland Heights, or was that the golf course? One of those two was called Starland Heights. That's their name. The agreement itself is our agreement. The footnote that you see there is for their business purposes, just for ease of reference for them.
Very good.
So it's theirs.
Okay,
Thank you.
thank you. Any other questions for Clint?
Could I make a comment?
Sure.
Clint, the other night I was having a difficult time going to sleep, so I took this contract out, got page 5, and I was fast
You went right to sleep?
So thank you.
Yeah.
I appreciate that.
Just remember that if you're ever up in the middle of the night and you need to sleep, just look up one of my contracts.
So,
That goes for anybody here,
yeah,
by the
it's
way.
good for anybody.
You know, it's not limited to what he writes.
Perfect. Do I have a motion?
Move to approve the lease agreement.
Second.
Thank you. Any further discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Thank you, Clint. And our last item tonight, as far as I know, is to consider an ordinance, and we're going to turn our time over to our famous Chad Wilkinson, our city planner.
Thank you, Mayor. We've had this conversation for quite a while now, and I hope you'll forgive me for going backwards one more time. I think it's important, though, just to, again, for context, and especially in the context of why the standards we're going to be talking about tonight are being brought forward to you. If you remember back in 2006, 2008 time period, there was a planning process, very well attended, very robust planning process, where we had a lot of good public participation, and they came up with some policy recommendations. As part of that policy recommendation, they came up with kind of a conceptual layout for what they felt that the downtown ought to look like. And if you remember, that concept was smaller scale buildings, pedestrian scale buildings, that means buildings that have pedestrian entrances out to the sidewalk, and parking located to the side and rear of the buildings. Now, the reason I've gone backwards just for a minute here to remind the council and those of us in attendance tonight about that is that these standards are trying to get at that. It's trying to create standards that facilitate this type of a development pattern. And that's really just trying to speak to that very well-attended, very robust planning process that took place all those years ago. Now, we're a year into this again. since that process happened, or since we started talking about this. So I do think it'll be beneficial to go over kind of where we've come in the last year or so. I know Gary forwarded a copy of this table to you. This was a way for us to try to get our hands around what the previous standards were, what we adopted back in October, and what's going to be presented to you tonight. And I think this will really help you to kind of see the progression of trying to get at that conceptual policy plan for downtown. So previous ordinances over here on the left side of the screen, as adopted in October 2017, kind of in that middle section, and then as proposed by the Planning Commission. Now, you'll remember at your last review of this item, you remanded this item back to the Planning Commission. They had not provided a recommendation at their meeting. They had forwarded it to you without a recommendation. You asked them to look at it again and come back with a recommendation. They've done that. They spent 2 meetings doing that, so they spent a good period of time looking at these standards, trying to figure out what was best. So I'm not going to go over each of these columns individually, but I do want to talk about a few things that are kind of important to look at. Building height is one issue that we've talked a lot about during this process. Back in 2007, 2008 time period when this ordinance was originally adopted, multifamily and mixed-use buildings were given a separate standard. And that's carried through, even through the adoption that we had back in October. Multifamily was given the standards for the RM13 zone. That's a multifamily zone, which limited the height to 35 feet or 2 stories. Now, when I say multifamily, that means a standalone multifamily project. That means all it is multifamily, no commercial component, just an apartment building, essentially, or other type of multifamily. Mixed use, on the other hand, at that time, had a standard of 45 feet or 3 stories, and it had this language, whichever is shorter. Now, it did have a step-up provision. It allowed for some additional height the further you got away from the property lines, up to 55 feet or 4 stories, whichever is shorter. And that step-up's right there, 1 to 1. 1 foot additional height for every foot of additional setback. As you adopted back in October, we left that multifamily standard exactly the same, 35 feet or 2 stories. And then we changed the standards for all the other building types. You'll remember we had a long discussion about this, 35 feet or 2 stories. We stripped off some language that said whichever is less, so that if a developer could potentially get more than 2 stories in a 35-foot building, they could do that. 45 feet or 3 stories, same thing on that. That's after a 100-foot setback from 100 west, 100 east, those perimeter streets. 55 feet or 4 stories. So that was the standard that was adopted by you back in October. One key component that we talked a lot about at the Planning Commission in the last month or so is that there is a difference in standard for mixed use and for multifamily in your current code, and whether or not that was appropriate. The Planning Commission's recommendation was that we no longer distinguish between the two, that we come up with one standard for all these different buildings, and that's reflected there at the far right. 35 feet at 100 west, allowing it to go up to 45 feet with a 50-foot setback, and then 55 feet at the 100 feet setback from 100 west. Excuse me. Okay, so that's talking about building height. And we have a couple of pictures that can kind of show you, hopefully, what that looks like. I'm going to come back to these pictures in just a minute. So this is that type of a building allowed with a 50-foot setback to that 45-foot. This also shows the offsets every 25 feet for our architectural standard that I'll talk a little bit more about in a minute. But that's the type of building that could be potentially built under our proposed standard tonight. This is the same building but turned a different orientation so that the width is different than in other words, this one goes 90 feet in this direction. And what would that dimension be, Brown? About 65 feet from that direction. So just turning the building. So the code is adopted in October of 2017. Could potentially allow for this type of a development pattern. So you can see those 2-story, 35-foot multifamily buildings right along 100 West. This would be a building not unlike the Hepworth buildings. They were able to get 3 stories in that 35 feet. And then this would be a taller building, longer building. This building's not subject to a 2-to-1 ratio requirement, so it can go a little bit longer and deeper. And that's something that could potentially have been built under the code that you adopted in 2017. Another example of that, taking that kind of intermediate building out and just showing those residential and commercial buildings. This is showing some parking underneath that building. We'll come back to that discussion here in just a second too, but that's a potential development pattern. And this would be as proposed today. So you can see smaller scale buildings. We've got that 2-to-1 standard in play here, so it gets that smaller footprint of a building. This shows that 35 foot with a step up at 50 feet to 45 feet, just to give you an idea of what those buildings could potentially look like, excuse me. Okay. I'm not going to talk too much about setbacks. Yeah, there was somebody had a question.
My apologies, I didn't mean to interrupt the flow. I just was wondering, could you go back to that first picture? You just barely had the one that was 1.2 acres with 50 residential. Yeah, can you go back to the other one just really quick? I'm sorry, I didn't get a chance to write everything down. Thanks.
Is this the one, Beth?
Yes,
Yeah.
perfect, thank
Okay,
you.
yeah.
That's it.
We good?
That's all I
Okay,
need. Yep,
okay, yeah.
thanks.
I'm not going to go over setbacks too much. The setbacks did change. You can see those numbers are pretty consistent across there, though, 2025. This is setbacks on 100 West. I do want to talk about density, though, at some length. This is a really important thing, and I'm sorry, I have to go backwards one more time. If you remember, back in October when you adopted these standards, you gave direction that staff take this back to a joint work session of the Planning Commission and City Council, which we did. You had a great discussion with the Planning Commission members about items that were important. We had a lot of discussion about building height, but we also had a discussion about architectural standards, about this 2-to-1 standard, whether or not that should continue to apply. And the reason that I bring that up right now is that we had a really important discussion at the Planning Commission over the last month about what standards should apply to mixed use, what standards should apply to multifamily, whether we should just not have any difference between those two buildings. The Planning Commission's recommendation is that we stop having a difference between those two. If you look at this previous ordinance, we had a difference between just straight multifamily development. That was 13 units per acre. That's the RM13 zone standard, and mixed-use development. Now, something really critical happened in October, and that's what's reflected here in this second set of columns, this row. We still had that 13 units per acre for multifamily, but one of the things that was important to the council and commission was to define what mixed use was. We'd had developments that had occurred that were horizontal mixed use. The Planning Commission had concern that that wasn't what was originally envisioned. It was to be a vertical mixed use. So we changed one word in the code. It's a section of code where we had just the word mixed use. It was changed to vertical mixed use. So what happened when we did that, when we adopted that standard, was it made it so that in order for this no density to apply, in other words, in order for that unlimited density to apply to a building, it had to be vertical mixed use. And then you can see on this proposed standard, there's no difference between the two. It's just none. I want to talk about that a little bit because...
Chad, do you mind explaining the difference in just a little bit more detail of horizontal versus vertical mixed use?
Vertical mixed use would be in the same building. Vertical mixed use means there's a commercial component underneath and there's residential up above. Those buildings on First South and Main Street are a good example of that. Those are vertical mixed use buildings. Horizontal would be you have a commercial building here, you have residential buildings over here. That's a horizontal mixed use. The buildings aren't even necessarily the same building. They could be separate buildings. We had a couple of those go forward that, the commission had some concern that that's not really what was intended. It was not supposed to be, in other words, there were exemptions given for mixed use. There were special development allowances for a mixed use development. And the commission had concern that it wasn't meant for that to apply to a horizontal mixed use, that should be a vertical mixed use type of development. So in other words, commercial in the same building as the residential. Otherwise, you could have a commercial building built on Main Street. You could have a residential component that had no density restriction that received that kind of mixed use bonus but wasn't really what was envisioned for mixed use. So that was a component that was included by the Planning Commission, recommended by the Planning Commission, adopted by the council back in October, was that we have this vertical mixed use clarification. So as we looked at that.
Can I just ask you, Chad?
Yeah.
So the purpose of that vertical is to keep a certain look, a standard for downtown. Is that right? To keep the look that we already have?
So, yeah, I think part of that is definitely part of it. The other thing is that when we had the original planning process back in 2006, 2008, it was determined that they wanted to have this kind of mixed-use, pedestrian-oriented district downtown. That was reaffirmed in the survey that we just did back in July and August. We asked people, that space between Main Street and 100 West, how do you want to see that develop? And the majority of folks said we want it to be mixed-use development, we want it to be mixed-use, pedestrian-oriented type development. So that, again, that's what folks have told us consistently that they want to see in that area. And it just comes down to, what is that mixed use supposed to be? Is it supposed to be horizontal, or is it supposed to be vertical? And again, the commission was concerned that the original intention was vertical mixed use, not horizontal mixed use, and so that was why that word was changed. Wasn't part of our original discussion that much, because it was something that I think the commission all pretty well agreed to, that this is what we want to see, is this vertical instead of the horizontal. So there wasn't a lot of discussion in the first go-around. One thing that the commission specified during this last round, the work session with you all, was that they felt like there needed to be better or at least some architectural standards downtown, that there needed to be something that required some articulation, some type of architectural standard. The previous standard was pretty minor, 50% brick or stone. On the multifamily, it required balconies or patios. For mixed-use buildings, just that 50% brick or stone requirement. You'll remember in October, we added a 2-to-1 building width to height ratio. We also added some language that required a primary entrance oriented toward the street. Kept that other stuff. The mixed-use buildings didn't have that 2-to-1 height to width ratio requirement, but did have the primary entrance oriented toward the street added to their requirements. In the latest version, we have more, and that was part of the discussion with the Planning Commission and what they had asked for. So we did adopt some basic architectural standards. Tried not to get too detailed. We wanted to give as much flexibility as we could while still having some standards. So the 2-to-1 height to width ratio was applied to all buildings, not just those multifamily buildings. Minimum articulation standards every 25 feet. Going back to those pictures, what we're talking about, I'm going to go back to the very first couple of pictures here, are these horizontal and vertical offsets. You can see in this building, it's not just a flat surface, it has offsets. They come out or in, and they go up or down to provide that additional articulation. So that's an example of those offsets in that building. Primary entrance, and we talked about that requirement, having windows and doors on the ground floor to create that pedestrian-oriented development feel. We adopted some architectural standards for buildings that have parking on the ground floor to make sure that we don't have just blank walls or big louvered openings, big grates right at the street level as someone's walking by, so that they don't look in and see those cars, similar to that building on 15th South that was approved, where we have the parking lot on the bottom, and you can just, basically there's no real windows, just some openings and some grates. There was a standard added to try to prevent some of that from happening so that we can keep this district a pedestrian-oriented district. And then I want to talk about this next bullet point at some length. One of the issues that came up as we were reviewing these architectural standards was, how do we define what these mixed-use buildings are? We've said that these mixed-use buildings have a different set of standards. How do we define what a mixed-use building is, so that when someone brings it into our office, we can say, okay, that's mixed use, or no, that's not mixed use? And we had a lot of discussion. We talked about it at the City Council last time, if you remember. We talked about a 75% ground floor requirement for commercial use. Took that back to the Planning Commission, and they had us relook at that standard. And one of the things that we did, as I've mentioned before, is we took that distinction between mixed use and multifamily away. Went through the code and took off all the sections of code that gave mixed use a special set of requirements and that restricted multifamily. But as part of that, we were still concerned about trying to create, again, going back to that original 2008 document, that look and feel of the neighborhood, that residential, that pedestrian-oriented feel. So we did take back a requirement to the Planning Commission that required 50% commercial ground floor use in order to make sure that we didn't have just parking right up to the edge of the building and had some activation. In other words, something that created that pedestrian entrance and exit feel on the street. I'll show you what that looks like a little bit, and then show you how the Planning Commission changed that. So this was what we took back to them a couple weeks ago, that we have a 50% ground floor use. Now this ground floor use, the requirement is that it be built to a commercial standard, but it doesn't have to be commercial. It can be used as residential, and that is to facilitate in the future the conversion to a commercial use, a mixed use. And the reason for that, again, is going back to the original plan and to what we heard in our survey, that people, that's the development pattern that the residents wanted to see, the people that were involved in that survey wanted to see. If it doesn't make sense to do commercial now, that's okay. They can have it as residential until a time that commercial does make sense. But we want to make sure that that conversion is not hindered by not having the right roof heights and not having the right commercial standard on that ground floor. So the Planning Commission looked at that, and that allows some parking underneath the building, doesn't allow the entire footprint of the building to be used as parking, but does allow for some. And that's a 90 by 90 building, which would be the maximum you could build for a 45-foot high building. So the Planning Commission asked us to look at a change to that, and the change was that they asked us to take that requirement away from properties that are right along First West and to move that essentially 200 feet towards Main Street, so that standard doesn't kick in until you get to that 200-foot setback from 100 West. And they asked us to change it so that it was no longer 50%, but was just that first 25 feet from the street. That would be that type of built commercial, but could be used residentially, or could be used commercial. It's a flex space. So that was the standard that they asked us to bring forward to you, and you can kind of see the footprint area there. 30% of the required parking is within that footprint. 75% or 70% is outside. That's that same 90 by 90 building footprint. Part of this design also was driven by some comments that we had from the public that while this works well on a corner lot, it doesn't really address those interior lots very well. And 50% of an interior lot would be a totally different thing than 50% of a corner type building. So that was the solution that the Planning Commission came up with, was to not require that on First West and to move it towards Main Street and to just require that first 25 feet. That's an overhead shot of what that would look like. And that's the standard that's been forwarded to you. So with that, I'm going to go back to our table and just talk about one other concept, maybe two. I think there's actually two there. Landscaping, we talked about a lot. 40% of the lot for multifamily was what used to be required, 10% for other types of development. That was maintained in your October 2017 change. The latest change is to require 10% across the board, but add a little bit of extra landscaping per unit on residential developments that include residential development. And just as a reminder, this is something that I'd kind of forgotten because we've been talking about a whole bunch of other things, but we did reduce the lot size down there for all these developments. We used to have a 20,000 square foot minimum. We've opened up development to a number of lots that couldn't have redeveloped previously by reducing those minimum lot sizes from 20,000 to 10 or 8,000. And that's a good thing. There's a number of properties that couldn't have been developed under the previous ordinance that now can because of that. So just want to go back to that, because I believe this will be a matter of discussion in your public hearing, but go back to that 50% requirement. I want to show the actual language that we forwarded to you as recommended by the Planning Commission. So this is that ground floor use requirement. You can see, in this case, normally when it wasn't in your existing code, we wouldn't include that strike-through text, but in this case, we wanted you to see what the difference was between what was proposed and what the Planning Commission, how the Planning Commission changed that for you. So for buildings located at least 200 feet from 100 west to 100 east, the ground floor story of the structures located adjacent to the street shall be built to accommodate an allowed commercial, institutional, or public use. We added this: required ground floor use shall be located along and oriented towards street frontages and shall be a minimum horizontal depth of 25 feet as measured from the front face of the building, with the exception of buildings fronting on Main Street. Excuse me, that's a new sentence. With the exception of buildings fronting on Main Street, residential uses may be permitted within that required area in lieu of that required use, which would be that commercial type use, if the ground floor is designed and to be converted to allowed commercial use in the future. Then it goes on to talk about what that would be: 12-foot floor-to-floor heights to facilitate future commercial, direct entrance from the sidewalk to the unit. It has to be ADA accessible if it's a residential unit. Well, it's a commercial unit too, that just applies. And then each ground floor unit needs to have some type of a porch, patio, stoop, something that gives it an entrance feature. Okay, that was a lot. Sorry that took so long. It's been a long journey. I'm happy to answer any questions if I can have a sip of water first.
So I wanted to make a comment while you're drinking your water. One of the things that I think this would be interesting more for the scouts as opposed to anything, maybe those of us who are currently adults are not quite sure how that would work, but the interesting component about this that I'm just going to comment on is the fact that the ground floor can be utilized for parking, which that in and of itself is not a big deal today. We see that all the time. But one of the things that they have on the floor this year is a automated vehicles legislation by Robert Spendlove. If you guys are interested, you can geek it out and look it up. And it's basically allowing for the long-term reality that there will be automated vehicles and ownership of vehicles would actually go down. So if you look at that, those current parking spots could then be converted into commercial and or residential use. So I'm just wanted to point out some trivia while you took some water.
Thank you.
So can I ask, on 14-7-107, on B, section B, what was the discussion, and maybe Richard, as a member of the Planning Commission, you can help us.
So 14-7-107.
What page is that?
It's 8.
8.
Thank you.
Or
Yeah.
59, whichever number you're going by.
So,
Okay.
letter B, where it says buildings located between 50 and 200, I'd like to consider something like 150, 100. Did you guys talk about that?
We had a long discussion at the first meeting about this building height issue, not so much on the second meeting, but the ordinance that was adopted in October had intervals of 100 feet. So 35 feet, and then 100 feet later, you could have a 45-foot building, then 200 feet, 55 foot. So this interval was proposed at 50 feet from the street, that it could go up to 45 feet high. So that, again, the building type that you could look at to show you what that would look like. And I want to give full credit to Brown Seabright, my assistant planner. He's here tonight. These are all his drawings. They're fantastic.
They look great.
We've got a really good resource here in Brown, and I appreciate him being here tonight. So that's what that building could look like. So it allows for that 45-foot height sooner. The other one would have been a full 100 feet before you could go to 45 feet. And that was the proposal by the Planning Commission. Certainly someone wouldn't have to go 45 feet at that 50-foot line, but they could.
So what about on B, where it says buildings located between 50?
Let me get there real fast again.
Interestingly enough, Chad, as you were reading this part of the ordinance, you said buildings located between 50 and 100 feet of the street property line on 100 West.
Okay, I'm sorry if I read that wrong.
You didn't defend anyone.
Okay. It's between 50 and 200 feet. That's where that next step up would occur.
Yeah.
What we found, and there's a reason for this, and I'm glad you asked that question, because I meant to mention this. One of the recommendations of the Planning Commission was, we want to have this 2-to-1 ratio apply to all buildings, not just multifamily, but to mixed-use, commercial, all these buildings. But we're going to allow that 2-to-1 ratio to be calculated from the very highest height allowed within that footprint of the building. So in this case, the building that we showed you, because it overlaps into that 45-foot area, the building can be bigger. It can be 90 feet instead of 70 feet, so it gives a little more dimension to that. What we found is that area between 50 and 200 feet, it gets you to a 55-foot building if you went a little bit earlier there, and that creates a longer building that we didn't feel was compatible with that original vision. Again, this is all based on that original vision for the city, but if you look at those, you'd be getting into this territory. I think that might be a little bit bigger than 150 feet, much longer, or 100 feet, excuse me, 110 feet. But it would get to a longer building, and I don't know if I have a copy of that. We had that drawn up for the Planning Commission. Let me see if I can find it. Was that under that same folder? Same document? Okay. Okay. So, that was just a decision. We felt, the Planning Commission wasn't looking for that, much longer building. So at that point in the block, in other words. So that was just a discussion that we had, and that was what we tried to capture what the Planning Commission said. We asked them if that's what they meant, and they said yes. So that just affects the overall length of the building. It gives a different place where that longer building can occur. Instead of at 100 feet, it would be at 200 feet.
Other questions?
So I just wanted to ask you, I recognize a lot of the work that went into this, so thank you very much. We do appreciate that. I just wanted to ask you just to make kind of a clarifying statement to the audience about, if you were to look at this building, Main Street would be on the far side. Is that right? Because you're stepping up gradually in height towards Main Street.
Over here, somewhere quite a ways away, actually. Yeah.
Okay, yeah. Just to make a statement and clarify that. And then I wanted to ask you, density-wise, in terms of what we have available that this could really be applicable to. Do we have like an idea? Obviously, we don't know what developers are going to do necessarily, but do we have an idea of the amount of building that this could create? Or is it just piecemeal, or do we have any ideas?
Are you talking about the amount of land that could be redeveloped? And, I don't know if we have an exact number. We can kind of look at some of the properties that are kind of ripe for redevelopment. This is a property that could be redeveloped. This area, there's some areas in between the middle of the block that are single family now that could be redeveloped. We've got some of these uses that we're seeing go away, some of these single-story bank uses and things that are up for sale now, and some of these other corner parcels that we've talked about in the past that could be, well, that's what I was looking for, could be redeveloped, but I don't have an acreage for you.
Okay, that was just a question that I wanted. Thanks.
Yeah.
I appreciate that.
Can I ask, on the drawing that you showed, the example that you gave, is that, I'm guessing that takes into account the landscaping requirements? that you're
Setbacks and
proposing?
landscaping, yeah.
So that's another question I had on 14-7-109, number 6, where it talks about the landscaping. So it talks about the landscaping there, but then it proposes additional landscaping. I just kind of wanted to see what the feeling was of the Planning Commission, or...
They were in strong support of that. It's actually it's a huge reduction in the required landscaping, especially for a multifamily project. It was 40%, so it's now 10% with an extra 50 square feet per unit. So it's not a lot. It's, for the most part, within the setbacks, you're going to be able to accomplish that level of landscaping, I would guess. It's trying to give a little extra landscaping for those residential units, a little extra open space. Of course, it's going to depend on how many units are proposed too. But it's not a big. It's a substantial decrease from what was required before.
And the feeling was that that would help developers be able to do better projects, bigger projects, frankly, with their existing property. I mean, to go from 40% down to 10% is a significant reduction.
The other reason was that if we reduce the setbacks on some of these side streets to 10 feet, then requiring 40% of the lot to be landscaped, it's kind of, it's a conflict in that standard. So we're saying do smaller setbacks, but we're also saying provide 40% of the landscaping. Going back to that table, so the old requirement would have been 40% of the lot is landscape, so that's been reduced substantially in the standard. And the Planning Commission fully supported that standard.
What was the vote in the Planning Commission?
On the entire package,
Yeah.
there was one dissenting vote, and that dissenting vote was Chairman Monson, and he expressed that he thought that we should, I think it was him, he said that he thought that we should push mixed use harder all the way to First West. So he was in favor of us requiring mixed use in the developments that go in between Main Street and First West.
So
and
what this
First East.
does is allow flexibility so that it can be mixed use or residential, right?
What the
That it
Planning
can be
Commission
converted.
has forwarded to you, actually, for that first 200 feet wouldn't require this, this mixed-use flex space. So that would just start at that 200-foot line from First West. I will mention that there was some discussion after the vote of, you know, some reluctance about that, and I don't know if you want to comment more on that, Richard, but we did have a little bit of discussion after that there was some concern that maybe that wasn't what they were after, but we advised them that they'd already made their recommendation, we needed to move forward with that, but I don't know if there's anything else you want to add to that.
I don't remember the other details that were discussed there, or the argument.
Yeah, just in terms of that 50%, whether or not that should be the requirement or whether it should be
Oh,
moved.
yeah, whether that ought to just exist in the 55-foot Main Street end, or
Or whether it should extend all the way to First West.
All
There was some
throughout the
discussion.
entire block,
Yeah,
in
yeah.
other words.
And,
Okay.
but as recommended, it doesn't apply at First West. It starts at 200 feet from
Mid.
First West. Yeah.
Or, yeah.
So what was the intention behind that? With it, just having it be that area? Is that,
From the Planning Commission?
yeah,
I think there was concern expressed by those in attendance at the public hearing from, you know, members of the development community that that would not allow for as much parking underneath the building if they had that requirement. Our feeling is, and we expressed this at the Planning Commission, going back to that example, now it doesn't work as well in an interior lot, and when somebody brought that up, we said, you're right, we need to look at that. But on a corner lot in particular, you know, you're not going to, if you were to extend the parking all the way to the surface of the building, you're not going to pick up a lot more spaces. You're going to still have the need to provide parking exterior to that footprint. You would pick up, in this case, probably 6 additional spaces within that footprint. You couldn't have an extra row of parking here because you just don't have the dimensions for it. You can't maneuver a car around in that little area. So you're really just talking about adding some spaces here. The bigger issue, I think, though, is what it does to your streetscape. If you've got parking pushed up to the edge of the building and doesn't have those entrances that activate that space and make it a pedestrian-oriented space, I think that's the issue that we're really trying to get at with that standard, is having spaces on the ground floor that are occupied not just by cars, but by, you know, business or residential, so we get that neighborhood feel similar to the buildings that were built on First South, where you have entrances that come right out into the street. So it's more like a neighborhood feel than just a regular, you know, residential or apartment type development where you drive in and don't have those entrances out to the street. So that's the bigger issue. You can see this building shows those entrances out to the street from that development. But the Planning Commission, you know, after taking public testimony, there was a change, and that was the change, is it's that first 25 feet, and that would only be starting at 200 feet from First West.
Chad, could I ask a question? What size of a building could we get on the 8,000 square feet? As far as a number of offices, a number of residents?
You know, it's going to depend a lot on what the proposal is. You're going to have to meet the parking requirement. Our parking requirement for commercial allows you to use parking on another lot within 500 feet, so you could potentially have a fairly good-sized building on an 8,000 square foot lot. with multiple stories, using parking on another parcel. If you include residential, that changes everything, because residential parking has to be located on the same lot or parcel. That's something that the Planning Commission has felt very strongly about. When we adopted the revision to the parking standards, that may have been 2 years ago, that allowed for that shared parking, they were very, very specific to say, we don't want this to apply to residential. Residential still needs to be on that same lot. So in that case, it's just going to depend on the number of units and how many spaces you can fit on that lot. And usually that's going to be a situation where you're driving past a building to get to parking in the rear. So I don't know if I can give you an exact number, but it's going to depend on whether it's commercial or residential.
If just a single-family dwelling, is that possible?
Yeah.
If someone wanted to just do that and not,
But not on Main Street.
No.
Not on Main Street, but they,
Yeah.
no, not on Main, on First West.
on First West, yeah.
Yep.
In the downtown, yeah.
Any other questions?
I've got a question about variances. Are there going to be any variances allowed to the ordinance as far as height and width? I mean, is there any accommodation available depending on the design?
The code has, of course, variances are part of the code, they're part of state code. It has to be based on a hardship, though, not just based on a desire for a different design. So, the flexibility for a different, the constraints of the property are going to determine what type of development is there. Variances are difficult to get on purpose in the state code. They have to meet a certain set of criteria that have to do with hardship. One of those criteria is that the hardship can't be self-imposed, and that's a difficult thing to get at with new construction, because you have the choice at that point to build the building to code. It's not to say that a variance couldn't be approved, but it's a process, and we have state mandated criteria, and they're based on hardship and not on financial. Can't be a financial consideration. State code says very specifically it can't be that this is going to be too expensive to do it this way. It has to be something that's unique to the property. So I think, to answer your question, I think, we've tried to build some flexibility into those architectural standards. We haven't gone down to the, very detailed level. We've just said, here's the box that you can develop within. If you can develop within that box, you can build, whatever you can within that box. So variances are a process, but for new construction, they're rare.
I was just concerned because if you look at the lots, the available lots to be redeveloped in this corridor, they definitely vary in size and shape. And I was just wondering if a developer came in with a common sense plan that didn't quite meet the letter of the law of the ordinance, if there was any way for the Planning Commission to look at it, other than the state code variances to give them some relief to be able to build something a little more common sense than.
Well, and common sense is a judgment call, but, I think, the answer to the question, there's no other process besides the variance process.
Thanks, Chad. Any other questions? And Chad, are you going to give a recommendation?
Yeah, our recommendation is that you adopt what the Planning Commission has forwarded to you. We think they've spent a lot of time on this ordinance, and I think that you have some options, though. You can either adopt what's been recommended to you, you can ask us for some additional changes, and we can come back and try to make those changes, or you can simply just deny it. So those are the three options that are available to you.
Thank you.
I think it might be worth noting that the only dissenting vote on the Planning Commission was a vote in favor of more restrictive regulation, not more development-oriented regulation. Is that correct, Chad?
Yeah, Sean's, and he expressed it to us at the meeting, was that he felt that this flex space requirement should extend all the way to First West, that we should be encouraging mixed use out there. So that was the reason he voted no.
Thanks, Chad.
And it was based on that change that was made at the Planning Commission. Our original recommendation was that we have that 50%. We still think that's a good idea. So
Thank you.
that's it. Yep.
Hey, Richard, maybe you could just help with one thing, and that is looking at the fact that we postponed the vote a while ago to look at this further.
Yeah.
I know this is an opinion I'm asking you about, but was that worthwhile?
Immensely. And I think it was worthwhile for both sides, because at the time that it got sent back to the Planning Commission, it was going to be an up or down vote on something that was not very pleasing to either developers or to the neighborhood. And I think that compromises have been made on both parts so that building height can remain lower on First West, yet step up quicker and allow for more density on the rest of the parcels. The restrictions that Chad was just talking about with the differentiation between mixed use and multifamily, and removing those restrictions so that now if you can park the project, you can build the project, essentially. And it was remarkable to me too, and I don't want to give Chad a big head because I know he's probably headed that direction anyway with his successes. But I mean, every meeting, Chad would come with, no, but he really would. He would come with new items that nobody had even discussed yet and open up a new discussion on a new facet of this problem or of this plan that people hadn't thought about. And so the meetings lasted maybe longer than we had hoped they would, but the discussion was productive. Compromises were productive, and I mean, I can't compliment Chad enough on this process. It's been awesome. And I was irritated that night when it got sent back to Planning Commission. Honestly, I was ticked off. And you probably couldn't tell because I really hide it well. But anyway, it was a great process. And again, these two guys have been unreal.
Well, good.
Thanks.
You know, for those of you who are observing, you know, it's sometimes the government moves really slowly, and for the most part, what I've seen is I'm really glad about it, because when we look at things, that makes a lot of difference. And this makes a lot of difference to us to have a public hearing, which I'm going to open now, to have your input as well, because again, it's nice. The more eyes, the more brain power that we have in some of these decisions that we have, the better it is. So I will open this now to a public hearing. Would ask that you would come and state your name and where you live in Bountiful. And I don't know that if somebody has said what you're going to say, I don't know if you'll need to repeat it, but we don't have very many people here, so we want you to be able to speak if you want to. That's the bottom line. So I'm going to turn the time now over to you.
Hi, my name's Eric Egenoff. I'm an architect in Salt Lake City, actually, and we've been working with one of the property owners in the downtown zone since, probably about July last year, and developed a project under the standards that were in place then, despite the fact we knew there was a moratorium, but that was probably ending. And so we followed this sort of evolution of the zoning code and these changes very closely. We've been at most of the Planning Commission meetings and have, I think, just brought some light to some of the discussions about parking and percentages and things like that. And I think a lot of those have been resolved pretty well to our hopes for what we can do at the site. The one thing that I will bring up that I've brought up at past Planning Commission meetings is the 2-to-1 ratio, and Chad's heard this before. He's probably tired of hearing me say this. Because the site that we're looking at in particular is a fairly long site, we do bump up against those length restrictions, so the 2-to-1 length versus the height. And so what we found is it's probably going to put us into a situation where we're looking at two building massings. And that has its own sort of issues that it creates with how am I doing parking on the site, how do I plan all of that out. The parking always sort of dictates the density of how many units you're doing. And also, I think it also affects some of the efficiencies of how you build a building, how you heat and cool a building. Obviously, if you don't have separate masses, you can do more efficient things with your systems. We've also looked at, in our past iterations of the project, including an elevator in the building, which becomes more cost feasible if you can have one single mass versus having two separate buildings where it might not make as much financial sense. You might not do it. And the project that we've been working on, we've really tried to look at sort of multi-generational. And so the elevator became kind of a key component to that. And I think with some of the architectural standards that they've written in at this point, there could be one that requires, say, something along the lines of like a deep recess in the building mass, which simulates a separate building, and that's how you would experience it from the street, but it could still be connected, say, set back from the sidewalk. So your circulation is a lot more efficient. You're connecting all the levels and have one sort of main circulation core, which can include an elevator. So that's something we've looked at pretty seriously and have been advocating for, and I know that's kind of gone back and forth, and it's not in there at the moment, but I'm hoping you'd maybe consider that.
Thank you, Eric.
Thanks.
We appreciate that. Thank you, sir.
My name's David Carter. I'm actually here for a prior item on the agenda, but I did want to speak towards this. I thought it was a great presentation. Looks very professional. A lot of behind-the-scenes work and what could happen and all of that. My background is telecommunications, and I would hope that as density comes into more and more play in the city, that you remember that the ability to provide wireless communications as an area gets more dense, it's going to require more antennas and things of this nature. So it was asked about a variance, a common sense variance. I thought that was a great comment. The more density, and maybe the wireless code in town now would allow for antennas to go on the roof of this if needed, but that would be higher than 45 feet as an example. So anything related to telecommunications, fiber optics being laid, or the ability to have that, this is the way the world's going, and it's tough to come in after the fact to bring up a brand new development up to speed with telecom. I think this is great. Just put a thought in the back of your mind.
David, and I will refer you to staff if you want to come in and make an appointment to discuss with our engineers and city manager these kind of items. I think they'll have the answers that will be helpful to you.
Okay.
And so
Thought I'd bring it up.
Nope, we appreciate you coming and speaking.
And Mr. Carter was here for the AT&T cell tower earlier. And,
right.
And there's some legislation pending that will address a lot of what he's talked about, but we can talk about that another
Just
time.
the small cell stuff we were talking about, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. And Kenny.
Here I come. Mayor, Council, thank you. I'd like to talk about the structure height on B, and it was discussed, Kenlon brought it up here. The building's located between 50 and 200 feet. My suggestion is that we make that 100 feet or possibly 150, but let me tell you why, is that you don't have to build a 55-foot building in that zone, but what it does do is it allows for a little more length in the building to address what Eric was talking about. For the getting density in there. So right now, as it stands, the recommendation from the Planning Commission was to go to 200 feet and then 25 feet of that frontage on the roadway along the streets be commercial. So my suggestion is that if we could go to 100 feet or 150 feet, then we can get a little more length in those buildings. And If we did do a 55-foot, if we moved 55-foot closer to First West, then we would require, of course, the commercial component to go in that building. So, for example, Chad, I wonder if we could bring up the plan on my building that we proposed. Is that possible?
Yeah, I'm happy to bring it up. Just for clarification, it's just for discussion, hasn't been formally proposed, so I just want to make sure it was,
He's right, it hasn't.
just want to make sure we're clear on that one.
So this is a building that we proposed back in July. Do you have a front shot of that on First West? There we go. And there's I think there's a little more detail there. So this would have been a 4-story building, but those, on the bottom level there, that was all commercial. And so, and I think, unlikely for First West, it probably would have been office space or beauty salon. Not likely, although allowed would be a 24-hour market or something in that zone. Probably not desired for First West. But that was a plan we had. But we can't build that building under the current, or the proposed code, because this building's 42 feet tall. But, I think that, I still love the idea. We had a center courtyard there, a public area where people could look over. We can't build that building. It would have to be built in steps. And now, Chad, I wonder if we could show one of your renditions of building massings, please. Okay, well, and then show me one with parking in your massing. Now, in this massing, there's not enough parking for that kind of massing. The parking needs to be in the buildings in order to get density. The parking shown in that massing is probably, I'd guess, a fourth of the parking that would be needed. Don't know.
No, it meets the parking code.
That meets parking
Yeah,
code for...
this one includes parking underneath this building.
Okay, all right, well, all right, so if we limited parking under building, which is going away, I think, restricting parking is going away, except at the 55-foot levels, is that correct? Is that...
As recommended.
As recommended, sure. So we could still have commercial on 100 West, so, or even, commercial areas. If it makes sense, people will build it. Developers will spend the money if it makes sense. But, requiring a commercial component in every single building in that area is too restrictive. It doesn't work out. It's very expensive to build. If commercial development wanted to occur there, I can tell you for a fact, they'd tear down the building and build commercial there if it was needed. So I'd like to, if the council can figure a carrot in there for commercial on First West, for light commercial, adjusting the 2-to-1 to where someone could build, like myself, on a corner, that I could build a nice commercial. Can you put that back up again, the other building for me, Chad? Thank you. That I could put in some nice offices or something in that area along 100 West. I think it'd be great. But again, I think the biggest thing is to try to move that 200 feet, move it to the west a little bit so that we could get a little more length in the buildings. I think would be very helpful. Thank you. Any questions for me?
Yeah. How long is that building?
Which one?
Yours.
Proposed.
Eric? How long?
It's over 150 as shown right now.
150. The lot that it's built on is 267 feet deep. So, and that would have parking. That would have parking underneath. And a great deal of parking underneath and then along the edges on the inside of the property.
And all the commercial faces First West, yes?
Yeah, in that rendition, the commercials there's another picture there too, I think, that details that a little better. Right there. Is that it? Is that the front? That's the back. Okay, that would be the front, that'd be the face of the building there on First West. I don't see anything matter with that. Anything else?
Any other questions for Kenny? Thank you, Kenny.
Thank you.
Scouts don't have any questions for
The
us.
microphone's up here, guys.
School tomorrow.
Please.
Hello, my name's Todd Willie, 66 East, 1200 South, Bountiful. I just want to make sure that I've got a correct understanding of what's being proposed tonight. Based on our last meeting at Planning and Zoning, Ms. Sharon Spratley forwarded on a motion that was voted on 4-1 in favor of this proposed text that was published on the 16th of this month, with one key change to section 14-7-112, number 7, which was the topic of great debate.
Sorry, what's the section?
This is 14-7-112, number 7, right?
It's number 7?
I show number 7 on page 13.
Oh, boy.
I think we've fixed that number to number 9. I think we had an
Okay.
incorrect number.
Thank you.
It's right on the screen before you.
Oh, yes. So
Alrighty.
I just want to make sure, her motion, as I understood it, was to forward on this body of text as written, with one exception, that section being number 9, only applying to buildings 55 feet. Is that a correct understanding, Chad?
It was to apply to those buildings where they could be 55 feet.
Right. But again, I just want to make sure I understand this. So anything smaller than that, 35, 45, this section would no longer apply? Is that correct?
Correct.
That's correct. Okay.
That wasn't my understanding. No, it would be any building 200 feet away from 100 west, 100 east would have this requirement, regardless of the height. So if we misunderstood that, then that's something to discuss, but...
If I may ask Mr. Higgins, was that your understanding, that it would only apply according to the motion to buildings 55 feet?
I think when we talked about it, honestly, I don't remember completely clearly if we said in the 55-foot zone or in 55-foot buildings.
So I was very, very tuned into that key part, because this is a deal killer for us. And as the motion was set forth, this section, number 9, was only to apply to buildings 55 feet.
That seems familiar to me.
Yes. And that understanding received a 4-1 in favor of. If that is how we are looking at this, I'm on board with all the other changes. I'm on board with number 9, provided that it only apply to buildings of 55 feet. And if that is the case, and my understanding is correct on that, then I can support this language that was published on February the 16th this year.
That's not our understanding. I'm sorry, it's just not. So we were understood that it was within that 55-foot area, not a 55-foot high building.
I would, with respect, I would ask that we revisit immediately the minutes of that meeting and clarify, because that is the hinge point. Not that I need to remind this board, but this has been going on for a year. It's been going on far too long. This is now, our 12th meeting, something like that. It's time to end this. We had a unanimous support in favor of this, with the recommendation from Ms. Spratley that it did apply to 55-foot tall buildings, and it's time that we vote on that. Let's move this forward so we can all progress. The building window is closing, interest rates are going up, as is construction costs. I don't think it's fair to push this any further. I would ask that we take an adjournment and go over those minutes to see exactly what was forwarded on.
The minutes, we'd have to listen to them. They're not prepared yet. We're on a 2-week cycle, so there's not a way to review some written minutes right now. We'd have to listen to the meeting. I guess I'm just a little bit curious, because I think that's the property that you're looking to develop.
Yes.
And that 200 feet would begin after your property, so I'm not sure how that would
Well, I
impact
just
your
want to make
project.
sure that this is more than just the 200 feet. This is about requiring 50% or 35%, which is a number I'm only hearing tonight, of dedicated space to be used for something else other than parking. That's really the key that...
So there's no percentage requirement anymore. The new text is that the first 25 feet measured from the street be those uses, but there's no percentage requirement anymore.
Okay. So I would just want to, before we vote, be crystal clear on what was being forwarded. As I remember it, and Mr. Higgins saying that sounds familiar, this only applied to buildings 55 feet. It came to this board tonight with a 4-to-1 vote in favor of that. So I would ask that if that be honored as it was set forth by the Planning and Zoning Board.
We just disagree that was the recommendation.
Sure, and I totally get that. That's why I say, we've had plenty of time to prepare this. This has gone on for a year. Let's visit the minutes. Let's adjourn and visit the minutes. Let's see what it's all about.
As was mentioned, there aren't minutes.
I'm sorry. Let's revisit the motion then. That's my advice.
Certainly, the city council, if they feel they want to make that requirement tonight, they could do that. They can make that change right now on the spot. So,
okay.
So I would say, though, that our concern with that would be that, we're now having to treat a building differently that's a different height in that same district. And that's a tough policy for us to try to administer. We've got a standard now that not only applies a different horizontal measurement, but now we've got to look at, okay, if it's a 52-foot tall building, it's going to not have the requirement to have that 25 foot of commercial space, and we don't think that was the intent. So we could certainly revisit that with the Planning Commission, but that's going to...
With all due respect...
Or if the city council wishes to make that change tonight, you can, but there would be concern about how that would be administered exactly. I mean, we don't anticipate that there'll be a lot of 55-foot tall buildings, for one thing. There could be, but parking's going to be a determining factor on those. So this could have the effect of just making that standard not apply.
I think the best way to proceed is, you've heard from Mr. Willie that his interpretation, you've heard from staff what their interpretation was. The council is the one that makes the ultimate decision. You can consider that and consider both of those viewpoints and make that decision. They're not bound by the...
I understand, it's just a recommendation.
And so...
I just want to be clear about what that recommendation was, not only to me, but everybody else that I talked to, and that was their understanding as well.
Well, not everybody else, because...
Well, the developers, yeah,
Okay.
which were the ones that were in the meeting.
Sure.
Yeah.
But so was staff, and staff
To be fair,
disagrees.
yeah.
Okay.
Sure. Thank you for your time.
Hey, thanks, Mr. Rowley.
Yeah.
Any others, please?
Can I go again?
Please, Kenny.
Thank you. So I don't know, I think that maybe there's just a misunderstanding, and maybe it's with me, but as I understood it, is that at 200 feet, that's when the commercial component, or whatever you want to call it, becomes effective. There was no commercial requirement for any properties for First West, west of that. So there was no commercial requirement. I don't know if Mr. Willie was planning on, well, he couldn't build a 55-foot building unless he got to 200 feet, as the recommendation is now. So I'm wondering if there's just a misunderstanding. As I understand it, there was no commercial requirement to be in any properties, talking about First West, west of 200 feet. Is that?
That's correct.
That's correct.
So I'm wondering, Mr. Willie, is that, do you have a? Yeah, it only applies, as I understand it, at 200 feet, the council decides. The commercial requirement doesn't take effect with the proposal until, you understand that? Okay, all right, so, thank you.
Thanks, Kenny.
Thank you.
Thanks for clarifying. Appreciate it. Partner.
My name's Jay Goff. I'm working on a project for, a property located at 100 West, 195 South. It was the property that Chad pulled up earlier. I think there is a little bit of a misunderstanding there, Chad. The first time I'm seeing this new text is just here tonight, and that may be my fault. I don't know if it was part of the agenda for tonight, was it? It was. Okay, very good. So just to kind of go right to the point here, our property right here, we can build, or sorry, there's no requirement for the main floor as far as the commercial element, as far as anything besides parking. Is that correct?
There's just no requirement.
Okay.
We don't specify parking or no parking, there's just no requirement.
I think that's what we were trying to clarify. So
It doesn't start till 200 feet.
okay, so the whole, if we chose, the entire bottom floor could be parking on that property, is that correct?
Subject to some architectural standards for the parking.
Certainly.
Yeah.
Okay. Really, that was my question, so.
Yep.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
As proposed, as recommended, yeah. The council can change.
Any other questions? Any other comments? You're welcome. If not, with that, we will close the public hearing. Thank you for all of you who participated. And we will look for comments and actions here. Any other comments from you, Chad?
Only if you have other questions you'd like to ask.
If not, then I would...
I've got a question.
Okay,
for Chad.
please.
Chad, talk a little bit about the possibility of moving that 55-foot limit further west.
Councilman Higginson,
Yeah.
sorry, this is new protocol. Because we're broadcasting, you have to speak right into the microphone or the people at home can't follow along.
Even if you don't want them to hear what you're saying?
That's a different story.
Okay.
That was a nice full disclose.
Chad, could you please talk about the ramifications of moving that 55-foot limit west?
We could certainly move that west. We've had a couple of, you're talking about the commercial, just so I'm clear, we're talking about the commercial, the flex space requirement or the height?
The height.
The height? Yeah, I mean, that's an option. 200 feet's not quite mid-block, but it does give some separation between those larger buildings and First West. That was kind of the idea behind it. But whether that's at 200 feet or 150 feet or 100 feet, I do want to show, I think, Brian, we might be able to find that. You can guide me to which one it is. Maybe it was outside of there. Maybe it's that one, right? I think it is that one. Yeah. I mean, just so you have an idea of what that potentially could do. We did talk about this at the Planning Commission. Did I go past it? Oh, yeah, there you go.
Oh, okay.
So, I mean, that's what could happen. If we went at 100 feet, you'd have a building that step. And when we asked the Planning Commission if that's what they had in mind, they said no. They were looking at something that was more like some of those other drawings that we showed. We thought that's what they had in mind with some additional height later on in the block. We got the affirmative on that's what they had meant, but you can certainly, do a variety of things there. It's a policy call. It's just where do you want that height to start? Where do you want it to be at 200, at 100 feet, at 150 feet? Do you want it to be right on 100 west? I mean, it's just a policy decision at that point. It does create, as you can see in that drawing, a longer building, potentially.
In your professional opinion, do you think that the scale of the building becomes out of sorts?
Yeah, I do. I think that the idea back in that original process was for smaller scale, smaller footprint buildings, especially along First West. And I think when we get to that size, it's not consistent with that original policy direction. You can set new policy tonight if you want to, but yeah, the answer is, I think this is more consistent with that smaller footprint idea than a longer building would be at that location. As you get toward Main Street, I think that smaller footprint idea is maybe less important. Even back to that policy document, that the buildings were taller along Main Street as you got closer to Main Street. But just going back to this, the idea was smaller footprint buildings on those areas close to First West. And I think that that type of a building's more consistent than something longer there. So, yeah.
Thanks.
Good. Any other questions? If not, I would look for a motion.
Well, hold on for a second.
Okay.
Is there any appetite with the council to change 14-7-109A6 back to the original version without the red line added for, well, so that it would say that the approved landscaping must cover a minimum of 10% of the development site, exclusive of any park strips in the right-of-way, and then end it right there. It gives the developers a little more leeway into as to what they can design and build.
What page
Is
was
there
that
any
again?
appetite for
It's
that
this,
at all?
it's the standard
Page 9.
on the screen.
Okay. Page 8.
I'll tell you what the Planning Commission talked
Number
about
6.
when it was originally discussed, and that is there was some hesitancy on some parts to move this all the way down to 10%. So I think that this is a generous offering, and I think that the movement in the housing industry is to accommodate folks in there with personal space and additional landscaping required for their per unit.
Beth, you look like you might have a feeling about that?
I'm still contemplating. I have,
Okay.
so I guess I can go ahead and start. I was not a fan of the down zone, and I recognize that that was not the majority position on that, because I do feel like we want to be able to bridge this gap between offering our residents multiple types of housing options and the ability to have them built. And we obviously need to look towards the future where we recognize also that density is going to be part of this equation. Density that is well thought out and well planned is obviously the ideal model. And as Chad has mentioned in the past, the single family, the low density multifamily, and I can't remember if you said moderate density, I can't remember where you were at on that, but, and then of course higher density. And so I'm willing to entertain the concept of starting the, instead of starting at the 200-foot mark, I would be willing to start at the 100 or, even the 150. I think that we have to be able to balance the properties that we do still have as having some type of opportunity to be developed down the road. And that's what I am wanting to look at. And I recognize that it is a difficult and challenging subject for a lot of people because and as it was mentioned in the previous public hearing, no one wants to be Sugar House here in Bountiful, and that's not what I'm suggesting or proposing, obviously. But I do think that we need to have multiple housing options, and we have limited space. We're built out, and so if there is an opportunity to do that, that's where I would start to look at it. And certainly, moving the 55-foot limit further west is something I'd also be willing to entertain. So that's kind of where I'm at this stage, so.
So you gave 2
More
points,
of a
but I thought they
statement.
were the same point.
Well, they kind of are the same point in the sense that I'm trying to talk myself into this. Conceptually, I really do appreciate all of the work that has gone into this, and I just fundamentally disagree with the fact that I think we need more density, and unfortunately, I know that that's not what people want, and so I guess I'm really trying to talk out my feelings in terms of what I would like to see balanced with what has been proposed.
So on page 8, 14-7-107 on B, where would we stick in like a proposal for something like 150?
On line B,
So the first
you
B or
just
the second
changed
B?
200 to
sorry.
150.
Oh, yeah. there's
I'm
gonna be-
sorry, there are two
I was
Bs.
going to mention that, and I didn't want to make you feel bad, Chad. The first
I'll tell you what.
B.1 or B.2.
I've gone through this so many times trying to find that very thing, and you just miss one, and it's just, ugh. And I hate Microsoft Word, just so you know. You change one letter and it changes the entire document. Anyway, that's another story.
Noted.
That's why you use a Mac.
Well, we've made some comments.
So to answer Kenlon's question, you could change on the second B, which will be changed before adoption to a C. You could just change that to 150 feet
Instead of the at least 200.
and just
Yeah.
make all those numbers consistent with that. There's other places we'd have to change that, but we could do that.
Yeah. Well,
Or 100 or whatever.
I would be amenable to that.
Chad, could you, just for some of us that are struggling, could you explain the practical effect again of what that would do to the shape of the building and really, does it make it longer?
Yeah, if you decrease that setback, then you're going to have a longer building at that location as well as a higher building because of that 2-to-1 standard. So you'd have 110 feet building. So we showed earlier, you'd have a longer building potentially. If that was 100 feet, for example, you could build something like this. You could also, just push that over so that this, I'm pointing at the screen, so that this building is just now 55 feet, the entire mass of that building, and that same height. It would have a commercial requirement now, but it would also, based on the Planning Commission recommendation, bring that commercial requirement out to that area as well. When I say commercial, it's a flex space. It could be residential for now, but flex space requirement. So the flex space would start here as well under that standard. So it's a matter of what that development looks like. I'm going to try to show, the idea again is that we step back the density. This is a good example of what that looks like. It's lower density as we're close to First West, increasing in density as we get closer to Main Street. And it's just trying to capture what that original recommendation was the smaller footprint buildings kind of closer to First West and larger as we get closer to Main Street. And I want to just, again, we've talked a lot about density. We're talking really about high density and a little bit higher density. We're not talking about low density versus high density. It's higher density versus a little bit higher density. The Hepworth project that we've used a lot of times as an example is about 18 units to the acre. That's high density. You can go higher density, certainly, but it's not low density versus high. It's high versus a little bit higher. And so you can kind of see what the footprints of those buildings look like as they get close. So if you can imagine that this building that I've got the crosshairs on moving about where that building is, that's the difference in the development pattern there. So you're moving those large scale buildings closer to First West.
Thank you for that explanation. Thank you, Gary.
Again, maybe worth mentioning that the only dissenting vote on the Planning Commission that this council voted to remand this item to was dissenting in favor of more conditions, not of more lenient standards.
Thank you.
With that, does someone want to offer a motion?
I'd be happy to make a motion. Let's see if I can do this here. I would like to consider granting approval of ordinance 2018-02, amending the development standards of the downtown zone with the recommended changes by the Planning Commission, with the exception of changing the 200-foot marker to 150 feet.
Do I have a second?
Second?
Before you vote on that, would that apply to everything where that 200-foot effects, so including the commercial flex space component as well? Just so it's clear for the motion.
Yes.
Okay.
It would basically just simply change the 200 to 150 and leave the flex space notation intact, so that would be applicable.
And just to address the concern that was raised, that would include buildings any building in that 150 feet, not just buildings that were 55 feet tall. So if they chose to build a lower building, they'd still be required to put in that flex space.
Yes, I
Okay.
understand that.
Okay.
And so I have a motion and a second. Any further discussion?
Yes, that essentially kills Mr. Willie's project that he got up here and talked about. So,
Any further?
I'm not saying that
So-
we need to vote
Any?
No, I know, but
because of his
No,
project.
that's a good
I just
consideration.
want you to understand.
it is a good consideration
right.
because
Thank you.
that's not my intention. My intention was to allow a little more flexibility, 50 feet more worth of flexibility in terms of that. And my understanding of the flex space was that it could be residential as part of that equation. But if that is not if I'm not getting to what I'm thinking of, then maybe I'm not understanding it. So,
So it can be used as residential, but the comment that was made earlier was that that space would be needed as parking in the existing thought process and not be required as,
So back to you, Beth.
yes. So as far as the
So just
Wow,
procedurally,
it's like a
just really quick,
conundrum.
you've got a motion and a second, so you either need to vote on that or withdraw that motion, or make a secondary motion.
A substitute motion? Yeah.
I'm going to withdraw my motion.
Okay.
And the person who seconded that agrees.
Kendall?
Yeah, sure.
Just one other, Mr. Mayor, sorry to interrupt if I could. I mean, just as you're making these motions, we're going to, as staff, we're going to move forward with whatever you give us tonight, and we're going to work with developers to try to work within these ordinances and make some great developments downtown. But, my recommendation would be to concentrate on what it is you're trying to accomplish down in that area, to think about the look and feel of that area. Maybe, we've showed you a whole bunch of different examples of what those standards might accomplish. Think about those types of considerations rather than maybe, the impact on an individual project. We're talking about development of the whole downtown. So it's just, it's really, how's this downtown going to look and feel? What are the buildings going to look like? That's what the consideration needs to be at this point, and then we'll work through these standards with whoever the developer is.
Thank you, Chad.
I have a quick question, Chad.
Sure.
Thank you for that, and thank you, Mayor.
Sure.
So if this is how it would exist with the language that was written, this diagram up here, and then if you...
That or that. Just that's a building turned the opposite way, but yeah.
Right. And then if you wouldn't mind bringing up the one that included the 55-foot height version, can you tell me what the parking, because it's the 25% is still going to be facing the street, right? So tell me what that would look like for parking versus,
It might be better to show that other slideshow. Let's get the right one up here. So, your length of your building could be a little bit bigger, but this would be that first 25 feet portion of flex space, and then parking behind that. So this is a 90-foot building. You'd have another 20 feet of building length back here, potentially, and then you could have parking underneath that as well. Or alternatively, it could be turned on its side, but that first 25 feet would still be
still in play, yeah.
flex space, yeah.
Forgot the night.
Mr. Mayor, I'll be happy to give a go at a motion.
Thank you, Richard.
I'd be happy to make a motion that we pass ordinance 2018-02 as printed and presented by staff.
Do I have a second?
Yes, you do.
Any further discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? That motion passes. Wow. Thanks for all of your participation.
Yes,
Thanks.
thank you.
Thanks for your input. It has been arduous, but I believe it's been worth it.
I don't think we could have gotten another motion.
Do we have a motion to, are there any other things from staff? Any other, Gary, any other things from from you? If not, I'll look for a motion to
I've got a
adjourn.
question if I could.
Yes, please.
This
Richard.
property designation, I read it, but I didn't read in your agenda or future agenda when we're going to discuss it.
I can address that. if you'd like.
Farm.
So we read through that. There was a little bit of I guess some things we need to work through with the property owner. They included 2 properties that aren't in Bountiful in the request. So we've talked to them. They're going to revise that request and resubmit it. We had originally scheduled a hearing for May 22nd to look at that, and that's just going by the basic Utah statutory requirements for this type of an application. That could be pushed back now because we're going to have to wait until they get us the revised application, but it would be, the Utah code gives us so many days from the time they submit to the time we have to have a public hearing. It's 120 days, and we have to do a whole bunch of stuff in between that. So once they submit this, we send out a public notice, we hold a public hearing at the Planning Commission. There's actually a county group, they're a board that looks at all of these requests in Davis County and makes a recommendation to you as well. That all has to occur in the first 45 days. Once we get that recommendation, we forward it to you and they make a decision. The Bangerters are doing this with all of their property throughout Davis County. They're making these same requests in every community. So that property outside of Bountiful will simply roll into their request with Davis County instead of with us. There's actually a little island of unincorporated Davis County right there that is about 9 acres or so. So that will be coming forward, but we've hit the pause button for just a couple of weeks while they get us a revised application.
Okay, thank you.
We will be in Washington 2 weeks. Our next meeting will be on the 27th of March. Is that correct?
Yeah.
That's correct.
Is that right?
Yep.
Good.
And I forgot, just by way of reminder, the council that want to go are invited to visit the Harriman Ice Ribbon tomorrow. We're going to be
Yes.
meeting here at 1:30 if you want to go down together, or meeting down there at 2:30. So if you're available to go.
Gary, I have to work tomorrow. I got called in.
I think we'll have
Still
a
frustrating.
couple there. I know that the mayor's going to be there, and
Yep.
I plan on being there as well.
okay, so we'll have a few that can report back.
Pictures.
Good, thank you. And for those of you who haven't,
struggle.
we have a employee appreciation dinner. I think it's on Thursday,
Lunch.
or lunch. It's at
I think it's the
Canterbury on
is it the
Thursday, the
15th? It's the-
15th.
is it Thursday or Friday?
It's a Thursday.
I think
then
it's a
it's-
Thursday, and it's right after we
So,
get
yeah.
back
I can't,
from this
yeah.
You won't be
deal.
back yet.
Okay,
Let's just have it twice.
yes. So Shauna needs to know that, so if you haven't spoken up to her, please do. And I'll look for a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Second.
Good. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. We're adjourned. Thank you. Really well